Hello. I'm glad you decided to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. In their book, First Contact, Bob Conley and Robin Anderson tell the story about two Australian prospectors who went on a journey to search for gold in the mountains of New Guinea. The story is told that one morning as they're making their way into the country, they top a hill and they spot this huge population of Aborigines that nobody knew existed. The Aborigine people living in that village only understood the world in that little part of New Guinea. They had never met anyone else or had a visitor from another part of the island. They measured wealth in seashells. They had never struck a match or heard a gasoline engine or even been told about gravity. Those people believed that their entire world was what they saw in that small little section of the island and that all of humanity was contained in that community. So the prospectors, not knowing what to expect, they moved forward with their rifles ready. However, the people weren't hostile. They actually greeted them with stunned amazement. Some retreated in fear, but others reached out to touch their skin or to stroke their hair. The Aborigine villagers offered them food and a place to spend the night. They walked alongside the prospectors singing and playing bamboo flutes. The villagers had never seen skin so white or bodies so clothed. They saw soap bubbles for the first time as the two prospectors bathed in the river. The natives thought that the lanterns the prospectors had were holding small pieces of the moon. These villagers were amazed because the presence of these two prospectors was so far beyond what their world had taught them to understand. Now, I trust that you've heard enough sermons in your life that you know where I'm going with the story. This wasn't the first time that a strange visitor came into the world and challenged our preconceived notions of what we understand. Jesus wasn't what the world expected, and he was a far cry from what they desired for him to be. The truth is, the world was not really sure what to do with him. They wanted a political power, a military power, someone who would force the people to fall in line. But we see that God had a very different plan. He wanted to save the world from their brokenness, not through political or military power, but through acts of love and grace. God's kingdom is so foreign to our way of thinking and to what we understand. The greatest in God's kingdom is not the most powerful, but the one who serves. The first in God's kingdom is not the one who sways political opinion. It's the one who strives to be last. God's kingdom's no ordinary kingdom. And when it came time for God to invade this world, he didn't send an angel or a simple messenger to come and tell us about his unfailing love. When God wanted to start his kingdom, he sent us someone who would meet the needs of this broken world and usher in a new, better, greater kingdom. A few weeks ago, we did a survey on the first two chapters of Mark's Gospel. Today, I want to go back into Mark's Gospel, but I want us to notice something else, or at least I want to talk about something else that captured my attention while I was studying for that lesson. When Mark begins his gospel, he begins by telling us from the very beginning who Jesus was. He doesn't beat around the bush or try to hide the fact that Jesus wasn't an ordinary man. His gospel begins with these words: "This is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God." Mark wants us to know before we read anything else that Jesus is the promised Messiah. He's the Son of God, but there seems to be a little bit of confusion about what that actually means. I heard an old preacher story one time about Albert Einstein, which means it could be true, but it's probably not. It just makes a good point. Anyway, the story is that one day Einstein is walking towards the university where he's working, and as he makes his way to the university, he passes in front of a hotel. At the same time that he's passing in front of that hotel, a wealthy woman is getting out of a cab, and she turns around and she sees Einstein. Thinking that he's a hotel employee, she says, "Grab my bags and take them into the hotel for me." Einstein picked up the lady's bags and followed her into the hotel to the front desk where she received her key to the room, and then he follows her up to her room and gently takes the bags and sets them in the hotel. The woman thanked Einstein and gave him a small tip, and he walks out of the hotel and makes his way back to his office where he would ponder the mysteries of the universe. I know it's a preacher's story, but it makes a charming point because we know who Albert Einstein is. From the very beginning of the story, we know that he is a brilliant theoretical physicist who's considered one of the greatest and most influential scientists of all time. But the woman getting out of the cab, she didn't know who he was. And that's kind of what we see happening in Mark's gospel. If you don't know who Jesus is, then a lot of things happen in the gospel and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you. And even though Mark tells us from the very beginning, this is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, we quickly discover that Jesus is not interested in sharing that same information with the masses. Well, Mark begins his gospel by letting us know that Jesus is no ordinary man, that he is the promised Messiah, the Son of God, the one that the people had been waiting for generations. In the first 10 chapters of his gospel, we see Jesus is trying to keep his identity a secret. In the first chapter, we read that a man is possessed with an evil spirit, and he plainly identifies Jesus as the Holy One of God, and Jesus quickly reprimands the demon and commands him to be quiet. If you go down a couple verses to verse 34 in chapter 1, we see that Jesus continues to drive out demons, and he continues to tell the demons not to speak because they knew who he was. He could reveal to the people his true identity. The same thing happens again in chapter 3. The demons know who Jesus is, but Jesus doesn't allow them to tell anybody. He doesn't want his identity to be revealed, not yet. And we discover all through Mark's gospel that it's not just the demons and the evil spirits that Jesus is commanding to keep quiet. In chapter 1, he heals a man of leprosy, and after the man is cured, Jesus says, "Don't say anything." Time and time again, Jesus is going to heal somebody and then instruct them to not tell anybody who he was, even when it would be almost impossible to keep that secret. Mark chapter 5, we read the story about a man named Jairus. Jairus' daughter is very, very sick, and so he goes to Jesus and he asks Jesus to help him. And on their way to his house, messengers from the home show up and they inform Jairus that his daughter's passed away. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Yet Jesus continues to make his way to the house, and we read that Jesus asked everybody but Peter, James, and John to remain outside, and they go into the house where the mourning has already begun. There's weeping and wailing, and it's carrying out to the street. Jesus cleared the house so that only his 3 disciples, Jairus and Jairus' wife, were left inside with him. They all went to where the child lay. Jesus took the child's hand and said to her, "Little girl, it's time to wake up." Immediately, the 12-year-old girl opened her eyes, arose, and began to walk. Her parents could not believe their eyes. Jesus told the parents, "Don't tell anybody what you have just seen." You know, that had to be a pretty difficult command to obey. I mean, Jesus raises your daughter back from the dead, and then he looks at you and says, "But don't tell anybody what just happened." I don't know about you. I would really struggle trying to keep that secret, explaining to the people weeping and wailing what actually happened. There's the story of Jesus healing the deaf man with a speech impediment in chapter 7. The people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him, and Jesus led him away from the crowd so that they could be alone. He put his fingers into the man's ears, then spitting on his own fingers, he touched the man's tongue, and looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, "Be opened." Instantly, the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so that he could speak plainly. And the very next thing we read in the text is that Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone. Then there's the healing of the blind man in chapter 8 when Jesus told the disciples, don't tell anybody who he was after Peter makes the declaration that Jesus is the Christ and the promised Messiah. In chapter 9, after the transfiguration, Jesus told them, don't tell anybody what you've seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Time and time again, Jesus is trying to keep his identity a secret, and it happens too often to just kind of be accidental. It's kind of like Jesus is Superman, but he wants everybody to think that he's merely Clark Kent, or that he's Spider-Man, but he just wants people to believe that he's lovable Peter Parker. Why in the world would Jesus want to keep his identity a secret? I wonder if Jesus didn't want anything to be said about his true identity because people were looking for a different type of Messiah. While Jesus was no ordinary man, the people were not really ready to truly understand what made him so extraordinary. The people that should have been living in this great expectation were instead living in confusion about who the real Messiah was. It seems that being the Messiah meant something different to Jesus than it did to his disciples or to the other Jewish people living there in Rome. From an early age, the Jewish people studied the prophets, and they taught that the Messiah would come and be a military or a political leader. They would pray for the Messiah to come and to drive the Romans out of Jerusalem and to push them into the Mediterranean Sea. They really believed the purpose of the Messiah was to restore the great earthly kingdom of David. The Jews saw the Messiah as a political liberator, a king, somebody that could lead their nation back to political prominence and glory. You might not be aware of the political climate that's happening in Jerusalem during the life of Christ. The people constantly had this thought of revolt. It constantly floated in the air. And everywhere you turn, there seemed to be men who claimed to be the Messiah leading their own rebellions. According to Jewish historians, there were at least 64 different people who claimed to be the Messiah and tried to lead a revolt against the Romans. When the children of Israel were living in exile, they received the words of the prophet Isaiah, and they longed for God to accomplish what Isaiah had prophesied. If only you would rip open the heavens and come down to earth, its heights and depths would quake the moment you appear, like kindling when it just begins to catch fire, or like water that's about to boil. If only you would come like that, so that all who deny or hate you would know who you are and be terrified of your grandeur. The people are looking for a Messiah that would vanquish the enemies of God and God's people. I'm beginning to believe that the reason Jesus is trying to keep his identity a secret is because he's not the Messiah that they were looking for. When Jesus showed up, the mountains didn't shake, the nations didn't tremble. Jesus didn't even come close to meeting the expectations that they were teaching their children. Because while the Jews are looking for a Messiah, they're looking for a certain kind of Messiah, someone who would fit their notion about what a Messiah should look and act like and accomplish. And Jesus wasn't that kind of Messiah. He didn't want to be understood in those terms. And he makes it clear that he came to be a Messiah of a completely different sort. Instead of being a conqueror, Jesus said, whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. In Mark's gospel, it's not until Jesus turned his face towards Jerusalem that he began to be identified publicly with the title of Messiah. Even though it was always who he was, Mark makes it clear that the cross defined what being the Messiah was all about. And so Jesus didn't want people to view him as the Messiah until they first understood what it meant to be the Messiah. I need you to listen to this, because I believe the real secret in Mark's gospel is not that Jesus was the Messiah. The secret was what it really meant to be the Messiah. The Messiah would be Isaiah's suffering servant who would willingly lay down his life to die as a ransom for others. The Messiah would serve others rather than being served. Instead of being a leader who would go out and kill and conquer his enemies, the Messiah would willingly die for his enemies. And that brings me back to why I wanted us to look at this again, why this has been on my mind so much. And I'm afraid that it's easy for us to misunderstand Christ or to have this false concept of who he is. There are those today who only see Jesus as the means to a successful and wealthy life. They believe that Jesus wants his followers to be rich and successful, and serving him is the way to get there. Their Jesus is the one who helps them get the Lexus and the house on the hill and financial security, but that's not our Messiah. There are those who believe that Jesus is perfectly happy loving the people that we love and hating the people that we hate, because if Jesus hates our enemies, then we have biblical authority to say hateful things and do despicable things to people that we consider the enemies of God, but that's not the Messiah he came to be. There are those that believe that Jesus cares about our political party or our social agenda, and we forget that Jesus calls us to love our enemies, to bless the people that curse us, the people that we disagree with, and to treat them with compassion and with grace. There are people that believe that Jesus doesn't really expect us to give him our whole lives, that Jesus is so desperate for a relationship with us that he'll accept any amount of time or effort. As long as we say that we love him, we don't really have to love him with all of our heart, mind, soul, body, and strength. We don't have to make any changes in our lives. But that's not who our Messiah came to be. Jesus is calling us to something more, something deeper. If we claim that he's our Messiah, then we have to be willing to follow his lead. If we claim that he's our Lord and King, we have to imitate the way that he lived and to allow him to use us to build his kingdom. As we make our way to the tables today, we need to figure out, how do we put aside all of our misconceptions and allow Jesus to define himself? Because once we do that, I think we'll discover that Mark portrays a Messiah far different from the one that most of us grew up thinking about and envisioning. Mark is quick to tell us about a Messiah who wanted to be a servant, a Messiah who's willing to suffer, a Messiah who calls us to come alongside him and to lay down our lives for his kingdom. It's my hope that we will allow Jesus to define who he really is, but to go a little farther with that, if we're going to wear his name, if we're going to try to look like Jesus and to love like Jesus, what we really need to do is we really need to let Jesus define who we must be. That's why when we go to the tables this morning, there's really only one question. I want you to spend a time of reflecting about, what does it mean to go to the table? What does it mean to have a Savior who is willing to lay down his life? As you take the bread, as you take the cup, to think about, what is Jesus calling us to imitate, to be, to accomplish in this world? I hope and I pray that as you spend time with the emblems and you spend time at the table today, that you'll be able to get a clearer picture of who our Messiah is and who our Messiah desires for you and for me and for us to be. I hope you have a wonderful week. Never forget how deeply you're loved, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.